I thought of you guys as soon as I heard the news, and I was in my kitchen, I was washing up, and I was cheering away. And I mean, again, I think we're all quite sad to see the back of Canada's first black Prime Minister, because, my God, that man blacked out more often than more than he cleaned his teeth. Quite the most extraordinary thing for someone who claims to be so woke, but there we are. But the reason why I thought of you guys at Daily Sceptic was you guys were so good at actually, telling the world and telling this country about what was really going on in Canada, outrageously, when we saw the truck drivers standing up against basically mandatory vaccine passports for truck drivers, and started this fantastic protest against Justin Trudeau's authoritarian lockdown policies and vaccine policies. And the clampdown from Justin Trudeau was absolutely extraordinary. And the way he's been hailed as this wonderful liberal leader, when he carried out a policy which, frankly, the mullahs in Tehran would be proud of, I find absolutely extraordinary. What do you think his legacy is?
Well, it's fantastic to see the back of Justin Trudeau, the man described as Canada's worst ever Prime Minister, and rightly described as that. I think he's one of the last democratically elected leaders who imposed these draconian lockdowns and COVID restrictions to fall. And as the public turns against these zealots with their extreme so-called progressive ideologies dressed up as a supposed moderate centrism, they all thought it was such a political masterstroke to imprison and mistreat their populations during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. And it certainly looked that way for a time. But Trudeau, actually, he was punished. There was a backlash when he actually decided it was a good idea to call an election in the middle of the pandemic in 2021 to try to capitalise on his supposed popularity, and found that he wasn't really so popular after all. That backfired on him. And it was all downhill from there. His most notorious moment, as you said, was when he invoked the Emergencies Act, a decision later ruled unconstitutional by Canada's Constitutional Court. He invoked the Emergencies Act to crush the Freedom Convoy, the protest, that early 2022 protest by truckers. Incredible scenes from Ottawa that we all saw that went around the world against vaccine mandates and expanded into protest against all kinds of COVID restrictions and all of that. And he invoked that act, confiscated property, froze bank accounts, and froze bank accounts of people who donated, $20 to the cause. There was a crowdfunder, wasn't there, to help fund these truck drivers and their protests, and people who donated, and millions was raised. That money was basically seized until there was an outcry and the money had to be given back. But actually, people, I mean, there were some cafe owners who just, we support these people, gave $20. Their bank accounts were frozen. I mean, it was the most outrageous overreach by a supposedly liberal government. Absolutely appalling. And there was a backlash against that as well. That was really not popular, as you imagine. You can see that in his polling. There was his disapproval ratings went up. They never recovered after that. He's not the only one, of course. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Jacinda. Another authoritarian dictator, if you like, from the COVID era, who was turfed out. These populations, they turned against these leaders who thought it was such a good idea to imprison their populations, because when the population was terrified by their politicians and by the media. But this is the thing. We're constantly told, and I was tweeting about this yesterday, and people are saying, oh, well, weren't they acting on the information they had at the time? No, they weren't. Same as our government. They didn't have information that said that was necessary. Virtually all the information we have on COVID, we had back in March 2020. And that's what's so extraordinary, is that governments like British government, the New Zealand government, the Canadian government, others, they terrified the living daylights out of the public deliberately to then impose lockdowns, and then said, oh, well, people want these things, and then tried to impose vaccine mandates and the like, and people rose up against it. And it is extraordinary that people did. But what amazes me is that he was still fated as this wonderful woke, right-on liberal. He was someone who would correct people's pronouns when they, he'd go off to a trade delegation representing Canada, whose economy now, by the way, is completely in the toilet. So, same as ours because of this obsession. And they would worry about, well, are you all using the correct pronouns of the Indigenous people? And he's like, worried about stuff which, frankly, is just stuff that most people just think is utterly irrelevant and stupid.
But this crackdown on truck drivers, what amazes me is that there was no public outcry about this from governments, from other G7 leaders, and also very little coverage of it in mainstream media. I knew all about this, and I've discussed this with people, members of my family, friends, and I've said, well, because of this crackdown, they go, what are you talking about? This truckers' protest. They knew nothing about it, and it was basically written off. Again, we've just got this at the moment. If someone disagrees with you, they're just a far-right, climate conspiracist or whatever, or something else. But Justin Trudeau went on camera and described those truckers protesting against having their bodily autonomy taken away from them and their livelihoods. He called them racist, misogynistic, transphobic, randomly, and every other word under the sun, and accusing them of stuff. I mean, this is classic, authoritarian playbook, and yet fated, and even the reports, BBC, Sky, ITV, talking about this man as if he was some, demigod of liberal values, when he was quite the opposite.
And Mark Carney, who's tipped to be one of his replacements, of course, former governor of the Bank of England and Bank of Canada, he described the trucker protests as sedition and insurrection. Extraordinary. We've heard those words in other contexts as well. These are authoritarian terms. These were protests against extreme measures, the like of which Western countries, supposed free countries, have never seen before. And yet these are the terms that these so-called liberal leaders, and he's trying to now lead the Liberal Party. No wonder it's tanking in the polls. No wonder it's set for a landslide defeat to the Conservative Party in the forthcoming elections.
Yeah, I've got quite high hopes of the Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre. He seems to be, very much genuine. I mean, I would say a proper classical liberal. But you said that this was the last Prime Minister, last world leader, who imposed these things, and who's still standing. And yet, of course, I mean, Macron's still there in France, isn't he? And weirdly, Keir Starmer, who called for more lockdowns, more restrictions, vaccine mandate, you name it, he called for everything. He's now since been elected. Is Britain just bucking the trend of what's happening across Europe and indeed America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and everywhere else?
Absolutely. As Macron, of course, essentially lost his election and is clinging on, but is on his way out. Britain, very much an outlier now with its left-wing government, sneaking in, of course, with this loveless landslide because the Tories were so useless over the last 14 years and have completely let down their voters and the population. And the split of that vote between, as we know from all the analysis that's been done with, the split of the vote between the Reform and the Tories, the split of the right-wing vote, really let in the left. But they're no more popular than anywhere else.
No, that is true, isn't it? It's just a weird quirk of our system. But, I mean, just finally, do you think the lesson will be learned by politicians who all thought, I'm going to be very, very popular because I'm pushing lockdowns and vaccine mandates and all of that, and that actually, as each of them has tumbled, dominoes falling, do you think that the lesson will be learned that, you know what, voters might say they like this stuff, but when they actually get the bill for it all later and their freedoms have been taken away and their health and mental health has been taken away, their children's education and their livelihoods, and they're paying taxes to cover the £400 billion cost as we are in this country, do you think that politicians might think twice next time?
I think so. I think that there has been a turning against. I think that although they're not necessarily admitting it out loud or saying it because they don't want to, because psychologically, they can't admit that all that they did and supported and all that was sacrificed was wrong. I think that there is definitely a huge reluctance now to support those things with this new virus outbreak that's supposedly going on in China. I don't know if you've seen about that. But reading the news reports, there's definitely a note of much more caution among the people speaking about that, saying, we've learned a lot since COVID. And I think
but the mask nutters are all back, though, Will. They're never going to go away, the mask lunatics. But there we are. Will Jones, editor of the Daily Sceptic, you've done fantastic work on all of this. Thank you so much. Quick word from Claire Pearsall on this. I mean, about, Canada's first black Prime Minister standing down.
Yes, the man who believes that a trans woman is a woman. He's gone.
I think if you don't agree with that, you're probably, as we've been discussing this morning, far right.
Well, there you go. So I'm glad I'm in the far right camp on that one.
I just hope you're using the correct pronouns about him because he feels very strongly about that. His fight against climate change as well. I mean,
How about, looking at inflation or housing?
Literally wrong on everything.
Yes,
I mean, wrong
absolutely.
on everything.
It was a good check, wasn't it? What does Justin Trudeau think? I'm thinking the opposite.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
Right.
Also, never blacked up. But there we are. I mean,
strangely,
I don't even necessarily think that intrinsically going in fancy dress, like you've got to dress up as Michael Jackson and you're white and you've got to black. I don't think that is racist. But apparently, this is a man who doesn't think that men putting on woman face. Because that's what the trans thing is. That's not offensive at all.
No, but you can black up.
So difficult to keep up with the rules. But also, literally, the man never spent a Saturday night not in blackface. I mean, it was the most extraordinary thing. College, he's literally blacked up the entire time. How? I mean, he's younger than me. How was that a thing? It wasn't even a thing when I was young, for goodness sake. Anyway, this is a strange old world. 11:50 is time. We're going to go to a break. We're going to be talking about the train drivers who can't walk on 2 inches of snow to run the trains. That's why we saw loads of cancellations at the weekend. We'll talk to Norman Baker, former Transport Minister, up next about that.